Welcome to our Israel-Palestine podcast, a project by graduating high school students from Berlin-Neukölln, home to Germany's largest Palestinian diaspora, and a second home to many young Israelis. Israel and Palestine are painfully present in our district and in our schools. We've spoken with historians, legal scholars, trauma researchers, and educators, some of whom are world-leading experts to better understand this ongoing conflict. Our approach has been multi-perspectival. We don't aim to resolve controversies or contradictions, but to hear different perspectives. Human rights and international law are the foundation of responsible multi-perspectivism. Can we learn to listen and hold conflicting truths at the same time? Find your own answers, or better, questions. Are you ready for the discomfort of learning? Welcome back to our podcast series on the Israel-Palestine conflict. You're listening to the second part of our special focus on trauma legacies in the Middle East. I'm Yusuf.
And I'm Alexandria. In our last episode, we explored the psychological and spiritual impact of trauma from a Jewish perspective with Rabbi Dr. Firestone. Today, we continue this journey from a Palestinian perspective, asking, how does trauma shape collective identity and memory? What does healing look like when the pain is ongoing? And how can trauma awareness contribute to peace building?
We're deeply honored to be joined by Dr. Sami Awad, a peace activist and spiritual leader from Bethlehem, who has dedicated his life to nonviolent resistance, intergenerational healing, and reconciliation. He's the founder of Holy Land Trust and has worked with Combatants for Peace, a groundbreaking movement of Israeli and Palestinians committed to dialogue and nonviolence.
Dr. Sami Awad was born into a Palestinian Christian family. Dr. Awad studied political sciences at the University of Kansas, international relations at the American University in Washington, D.C., focusing on peace and conflict resolution. He holds a doctoral degree in Divinity from the Chicago Theological Seminary. After returning to Palestine, he founded Holy Land Trust, a community-based organization in Bethlehem that promotes justice and peace through training, empowerment, and trauma healing.
In recent years, Dr. Sami Awad has become increasingly vocal about the psychological and intergenerational wounds that perpetuate the conflict and the spiritual resources needed to overcome them. In a prominent interview with the German weekly Die ZEIT after October 7th, he was called a Palestinian Gandhi. Welcome, Dr. Awad. We're very honored to have you with us.
A very warm welcome also from me. Thank you so much for taking the time. We are very excited to have you.
Thank you so much. It is such a privilege to be with you today. Thank you for this invitation.
To begin, could you tell us about your personal journey, what first drew you to peace work, and how your understanding of trauma became part of that journey?
Yeah, so I guess I can start by saying my journey began before I was born. Because I was born into a family that was committed to peace work and to nonviolent activism. The great influence that I give honor to is my grandmother, who in 1948, during the Nakba, the war that we call a catastrophe as Palestinians, she lost her husband in the war, who was shot by a sniper. He wasn't involved in combat. And days later, her and her 7 children were evicted from their home. They were kicked out by Jewish forces and they became part of the Palestinian refugee population. As you know, 750,000 plus Palestinians became refugees during that time. And my grandmother was a woman that always insisted that as a family, we will never seek revenge and retaliation for what happened to us, that will not lead us to gain anything back. Her husband, the land that we lost, the home that was theirs, that was destroyed. But she also always insisted that as a family, we will proactively seek justice and seek peace, even with those who did this to us. And so that was the message that she planted in her children and in us as grandchildren. The bigger influence on my life out of this message was my uncle Mubarak Awad, that in the early 80s, he established what was known as the Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence, taking from Gandhi and Martin Luther King and other leaders of the nonviolent movement. He said, as Palestinians, we can resist and fight this occupation through nonviolence. And from the age of 12, I started participating with him in nonviolent activities. The decision to become very active in nonviolence and peace work happened when I was 16 years old. My uncle Mubarak was arrested by the Israeli authorities. And because of his work in nonviolence, he was deported. He was kicked out from his homeland and never allowed to return there as a Palestinian. And for me, that really opened up a question. What is the power of nonviolence that makes this Israeli government see in my uncle a threat to it and decide to deport him? And that started my long-term journey and commitment to nonviolence.
Thank you. You've said that unhealed trauma feeds cycles of fear and violence. Could you explain how trauma operates collectively in Palestinian society?
Yeah, so for sure, a big part of my journey in my studying and researching, engaging in peace work was at one point to discover in a very deep and profound way that one of the key missing components when it comes to peacemaking is addressing historic wounds and collective traumas that are inherited from generation to generation. The question I began to ask was right after the failure of the Oslo peace process. As you might know, between 1993 and 2000, there was a peace process called the Oslo peace process, where Palestinians and Israelis were negotiating a peace agreement based on a framework known as the two-state solution. One state for Palestinians, one state for Israelis living side by side in peace. And that peace process, which technically was not complicated, was quite simple, failed. And I began to ask the question, why did it fail? What was behind it that allowed it to fail? And that's when I began to understand and discover that a lot of the negotiations that were happening from a place of trauma. Leaders were negotiating out of fear of each other, out of mistrust from each other. I traveled, for example, to Auschwitz and Birkenau to learn about the historic trauma of the Jewish people and began to understand how that trauma is not just a historic event, but it is something that continuously lives within the Jewish psyche. That one day this will happen to us again. And creating a state is a means to prevent that from happening again. And suppressing others is a means to prevent that from happening again. So I began to realize that trauma is very, very key in terms of how we understand our identity and also how we understand the identity of the others. Now, for us as Palestinians, to answer your question, we have been living under traumatic experiences, not just since 1948, for centuries, I would say. During the Turkish Empire rule, then came the British rule, and then, of course, after the war, we were under the Jordanian rule, and part of us were under Israeli control. Now we're all under Israeli control. Now we're seeing the catastrophe of a genocide taking place for Palestinians in Gaza, and the destruction of Palestinian communities in the West Bank, and of course in East Jerusalem. And so almost every day there is an experience of trauma. But what I'd like to distinguish is that there is the historic trauma that is inherited, and there is the present trauma that is experienced. And there's a difference between the two. Because the first one, as I said, shapes identity of how I perceive myself and the other. And for Palestinians, especially the Nakba in 1948, shaped a mindset of a people group that was kicked out from their land, that was ethnically cleansed from their homes, that was not received well even by other communities, like other Arab countries, where there was suppression and rejection even of the refugees that entered into these areas. So that created a psyche of rejection, of needing to connect to something that is not available, the sense of loss, and at the same time, the lack of a space where grief can take place, where understanding how can we deal with that loss in a very intimate and I would say even spiritual way. And so we create these stories of resiliency and power almost denial of what happened. We call it a nakba, a naksa, these terms that we use, this notion that we will have the power one day to return back, which is of course the dream of every Palestinian, but not done in a realistic way of understanding how to do that with the situation we are facing. So it's coming from a very collective trauma experience where we are trying to protect identity from being dismantled, but at the same time, this identity is causing a lot of internal frictions between us, a lot of groups that fight each other, because again, we failed in 1948, and that means who is to blame for the failure of what happened to us? And so we go into these internal struggles like we see happening today. So there are many layers to this understanding of how 1948 affected us as a community. I would even add the sense of entitlement, the sense that the world owes us, the sense that, the most persecuted people in the world, the Jewish people, are doing this to us. So that means the world owes us more because we are being victims of the most victimized people in the world. We don't deny the Holocaust. We just say we are the victims of the most victims. So that means we need more international attention to us. And that's why I think we see many Palestinian leaders turn to the outside world for support in helping us in our liberation instead of building the momentum and the power and the unity within the Palestinian community.
You've mentioned the Nakba several times and how it's perceived as a lived and remembered catastrophe. Also mentioned the Palestinian leaders right now. Could you elaborate how it continued to shape the identity and politics of the Palestine today?
Yeah. So back to what I was finishing up by saying that the Nakba, for example, what happened before the Nakba was a disaster for the Palestinians. It was a sense of betrayal by the Arab world and by different Palestinian groups and leaders within the Palestinian community. So we could look at the system of colonialism and say, yes, they had an agenda, yes, they had power, but and look at them and say they're to blame. But one thing that really never happened in the after the Nakba was looking into our issues as Palestinians, the fractions that were happening before the Nakba, the different families and different clans and different groups that sold their property and left the land early before the war happened. The fact that Arab countries that were supposedly there to support us in the war to prevent this occupation from happening did not do the job that they promised us, to say the least. And so that sense of treason remains embedded in us. And this is why we continue to have within our community this divisions between our groups. We're almost functioning like clans, even at the level of political parties. They function as tribal clans that are still fighting each other like we did during that time, arguing with each other, blaming each other like we did during that time. And this is part of what we have inherited, I would say, as a Palestinian community. That notion that we lost our unity because of the trauma that we experienced. When we think that we should be unified more because of the trauma that we're experiencing today, it is the mistrust that exists. It is the lack of respect that exists. It is the lack of unity, as I said, the lack of vision that exists, because every group has their own agenda and every group thinks they are the right group to lead us into liberation, and they fight each other. So I think this is the biggest trauma that we carry at the national level as a Palestinians as a result of the Nakba.
What happens when trauma becomes a part of national identity?
It's a very good question. And what I say is that when trauma becomes part of national identity, it becomes very, very difficult to heal it and to engage in it. And I would say, again, from my experience and my knowledge, this trauma has become part of national identity more within the Jewish Israeli community than the Palestinian community. Because part of Jewish identity historically has been an identity of a community that is marginalized, a community that is suppressed, a community that war is always declared on them. Even when we go back to biblical times. They're the chosen people, and therefore everybody else hates them because of this. There are even in certain feasts like Passover, Pesach, which is the big feast within the Jewish community. There are in the Seder, which is the traditional meal, there's the line that says that every generation and nation rises up to destroy us. So in the psyche of what it means to be a Jew, there is this notion that we are victims. Everybody hates us. Every generation and nation will try to destroy us. So that sense of victimization is deeply, deeply rooted within the Jewish psyche. I would say much more than the Palestinian one, because as Palestinians, we could look back at how we lived, for example, before 1948. Many Palestinians, you will hear them say, oh yeah, even in my father's neighborhood where he was born and grew up, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived together. There isn't an exclusivity to be a Palestinian. That this war happened, but before the war, there was tradition, there was culture, there was music, there was dance, there was food, there was celebrations that we had. The Jewish issue goes much longer. So what happens when it becomes part of identity? I would say it becomes much more difficult to heal, because in a sense, healing it means transforming identity as a whole. If I, if I say this is who I am, and my trauma is me, then anything beyond that becomes challenging. You're challenging my core identity. And then, so this is why I say it becomes more difficult to heal, and there has to be a process of awareness and awakening within the Jewish community, as we see happening with many progressive groups that are opening up to this reality and saying, no, we are not this, what we have been inherited as the identity of who we are. But it is a much difficult process. It's like almost peeling the skin off your body and putting new skin on. But this said, difficult doesn't mean impossible. And as I said, there are groups within the Jewish community, internationally, and within Israel, and especially after what we are witnessing now in Gaza, that are saying this is not who we are. We refuse to be part of what's happening, and our identity is much more than what our government is doing.
Since October 7th, many things have changed. The pain and the destruction in Gaza and the shockwaves globally. Even you yourself are personally affected as you have family in Gaza. Would you like to share how they are doing?
Yeah, so October 7th was a shock to all of us. What happened after October 7th has been a continuous shock to all of us, I would say, many of us, and globally as well, to see every day the atrocities that are taking place in Gaza, and as I said, even in the West Bank to a certain extent as well. I'll start by saying that for the most part, my family that was in Gaza, many of them were able to get out of Gaza. There are still some that are still in Gaza, and they are safe and they are okay. They are struggling, as all of the people in Gaza are. But the closest members of my family, my uncle, my aunt, and my cousins, we were able to get them out to Egypt and to Cairo. So they are safe. So thank you for asking. But we're still very worried about the rest of the family. So it's like my cousins, and also the people in Gaza in general. I mean, for us as Palestinians, we are all part of one family. And so we're very, very worried about them. Yeah, and since October 7th, it's been an absolute disaster, as you mentioned. And then for me, it's become very, very difficult to really to grasp on what can I do. I mean, all of us are always in this question of what can we do? What can we do to stop what is happening? And as a Palestinian, as an activist, as a person who's committed to ending war, ending occupation, it's become a very, very challenging question for me. And I wish I had answers. But I think part of what we are trying to do is to understand when something as big as a genocide is taking place that we cannot address, and knowing that even the international community at the political level, the United Nations, the international courts of justice couldn't address it, it is not to keep fighting that fight. It is asking all the time what we could do at the capacity and the level that we are in. And the way I describe this, and this is a big part of understanding nonviolent resistance, and I encourage you to look at this in your work, is if you look at it like the old Greek temples, you have the temple, the triangle on the top, and you have all of the pillars underneath it. Sometimes when you're looking at the triangle on the top, let's say it is occupation, let's say it is genocide, let's say it's a dictator, you cannot reach that because it's at the top. But to understand that there are pillars that support that thing on the top, the triangle on the top. And so we begin to ask, what are the pillars that we need to address? What are the pillars that support the genocide that we can begin to address and engage in and challenge and create alternatives for, and bring down those pillars? Because when we bring down those pillars, then the whole thing might collapse. Or what are the pillars that we need to build up for Palestinian resiliency, Palestinian steadfastness? Because part of what we acknowledge is that this campaign to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from the land might come on us, the people that are living in the West Bank soon, after Gaza. There is no guarantee that it will not happen to us. There are certain voices, very strong and powerful voices within the Israeli government that are saying this whole land should be cleansed from anything that is not Jewish. That means me. Doesn't matter if I'm Christian or Muslim. I'm not Jewish. I'm a Palestinian, and so my existence in this land is endangered. And so now we're looking into what does it mean to build resiliency and steadfastness and strengthen unity. In a way, addressing the trauma that I talked about, the trauma that caused us separation and division for so long. How do we bring that sense of unity together as Palestinians?
How has this movement affected your work, your message, and your hope?
Yeah, so for me, as I mentioned, it put me in a place for a long time where I felt completely helpless. I felt that this tsunami was very, very big, and we couldn't stand in front of it. But what keeps me motivated is also seeing how the international community continues to engage. This gives me a lot of hope. How grassroots movement, how millions of people around the world are seeing the injustice, seeing the atrocities that are happening on a daily basis, going out into the streets and demonstrating. And yes, we know that, at the political level, there are interests that bring these politicians together. Even if their communities say no, they still engage in this work. But this momentum of the international community gives me hope. How it has affected my work, I would say that my commitment to nonviolence is stronger now than any time before. I fully believe in nonviolence. I am committed to nonviolence. And I know that the Israeli government and the Israeli system does not like nonviolence, because this is one point that we always need to talk about. Because, many people say, oh, well, if you only use nonviolence as Palestinians, you would be better off. No. People like me have been arrested, detained, beaten up because we are engaging in nonviolence. So resistance is not welcomed by a system that oppresses. It's not about violence or nonviolence. Yes, violence gives it justification to do more harm to the Palestinians, but nonviolence also has that component in it as well. So my commitment to nonviolence has increased, and also I would say my commitment to building Palestinian community, to bringing Palestinians together. I used to do a lot of meetings between Palestinians and Israelis, but honestly, after October 7th, it felt to me that I need to put my energy more on the Palestinian side, saying that Israelis need to work on their side. They have to address their issues in a deep and profound way, because what is happening for them as Israeli Jews is they are going into a system of fascism, And this is not new. Before October 7th, Israelis were protesting on the street about the fascism that's growing in their community. And so for me, it's become very clear that there are struggles that each have to do in their own community, and there is a vision that each has to develop in their community. So that's where my movement has shifted recently. And my hope is in seeing the young generation, people like you, of Israelis and Palestinians and the international community that are saying, we will not allow this to happen when we are in charge, when we are leading our communities. This is not going to be the way it is. A generation that is more conscious, more connected, more aware, more engaged, more socially interconnected than any time before, that are not ready to fight wars for corrupted politicians like what was happening in the past. So my hope is in the growing generation of young leaders, Palestinians, Israelis, and internationals.
So far, how did it impact the peace movement?
Yeah. Well, I would say, honestly, at this time, the peace movement, the peace movement hasn't been a peace movement for many years, if I want to be honest. Since the Oslo peace process failed in the year 2000, there has not been a real peace movement. There has been many attempts to bring the two sides to sit and negotiate with each other. I think 26 or 27 attempts, and they all end up in failure. This is at the political level. At the grassroots level, at the level of organizations, you could only go so far as NGOs in building a peace movement. If the politicians are not engaged at the political level, then whatever you do at the grassroots level is very confined and very small, to say the least. So I wouldn't call it a movement at that level. And so the peace movement hasn't been around for 25 years, at least now. This doesn't mean that we don't want one, but I think part of what has happened now, after October 7th, is there is clarity. There is clarity on intentions. For example, what is happening in Gaza is not just about destroying Hamas and getting rid of an obstacle to peace. It is about destroying the whole Gaza Strip and creating chaos and creating a community that is barely surviving. It is collective punishment. And this is something that we as Palestinians have always talked about and have always experienced. And so it is an act of deep, deep destruction at levels unprecedented in even war, what is happening in Gaza. And so now we have to understand that peace cannot just happen with any system that causes such a mechanism of destruction. And the West Bank was not involved in October 7th. Not a single act of violence happened on October 7th from the West Bank. And still, land confiscation continues, building new settlements continues, ethnic cleansing of communities in areas near settlements continues without stop. Even yesterday, 200 members and family members were kicked out from their community just near Hebron. And so when you talk about peace, I think it's very important to ask who are your partners and what is the intention behind this. And for now, I would say, yes, now it's a time of resiliency and resistance and to build the momentum for peace to happen. It's not about jumping into peace immediately. You need to build momentum for it. You need people on both sides that are supporting that peace to happen. And this is why I said we need to do the work separately at this time, build that leadership, and then see when we could really talk about a real, genuine peace that is embedded in justice and equal rights to all the people that live in this land.
How do you speak of nonviolence and healing when wounds are being reopened so deeply and in real time?
Yeah. So for me, I create a distinction between the two. Nonviolence is one thing and healing is one thing. Nonviolence is activism. Nonviolence is resistance. Nonviolence is being strong in the face of injustice. Nonviolence is understanding power dynamics and how to bring systems of power down. So nonviolence has a whole strategy and component in it of direct action, direct activism, and resistance. And I think engaging in nonviolence is healing in its own way. Because for me, when I'm always asked what is a word that I could put next to nonviolence that describes nonviolence, I say it's empowerment. And empowerment is healing by itself. A woman who is abused by her husband, let's say, or by her boyfriend, the moment she stands up and says, no, enough, and walks out that door or responds to him, she has begun her healing journey. She experiences empowerment to be on her healing journey, that she steps out of the abuse. So nonviolence is activism that has components of healing in it. Trauma healing, for me, is very, very important, even in times of ongoing violence, because it is the ability to step out of the abyss that we keep diving into deeper and deeper and deeper. The abyss of hopelessness, the abyss of resignation, the abyss that nothing can work, the abyss of normalizing this as becoming part of our reality, the concept of victimization. And so, as I said before, there is the ongoing trauma that I feel is only addressed through resistance, nonviolent resistance, as far as I'm concerned. But there is the historic trauma that can be healed even in times of war and conflict, the one that's connected to identity, that one that's connected to inherited stories and narratives that we have been told. And so part of what we are doing now, the work I'm doing, is actually creating spaces where Palestinians come together and reconcile on our historic wounds and traumas. And that brings unity. And that brings healing. And from that, we can now stand up in power and say, and now we resist.
Do you happen to have experienced any backlash so far from either community? And if so, how do you deal with it?
Well, I think one of the main privileges of being a peacemaker or an activist is rejection. If you are not rejected for your peacemaking or your resistance and resiliency, then you should check yourself and say, am I really resisting or am I just playing it safe? I think backlashes from communities is always something that will happen to those that are really engaged in peace and justice work. People who believe in armed resistance do not like it when I talk about nonviolence. People who believe in boycott do not like it when other people talk about dialogue, for example. As I said, for Israeli, especially at the government level, any form of resistance is rejected. Colleagues of mine in the nonviolent movement have been arrested since October 7th, and they are fully committed to nonviolence. And so I think rejection is part of it. I would say, we're not sticking our head out to be cut. It's not like intentionally seeking it, but this is something that we expect and we wait. If it happens or not, it doesn't stop us from doing what we do.
We often think of healing as something that comes after conflict. Would you suggest that we need to bring healing into the conflict? Can you describe what such collective healing might look like in practice?
Yes, for sure. So the quick answer is yes. As I said before, I think it is very important to bring healing into conflict, because healing, especially of our inherited stories and wounds that we carry in our identity, as if it is removing things we carry on our back, heavy weight that we have carried into the present, and we need spaces to release them, to let go, so that we could stand in our fullness and in our power. And so part of what we have done in this work is bringing Palestinians together that represent different factions, different clans, different political identities that have historically engaged in fighting with each other. And to create space where there is healing, there is reconciliation, there is apology, there is forgiveness, We've had experiences where a person, for example, who represents a certain family clan with another family clan haven't been talking with each other. And in them coming together, they were able to bring the two tribes together to reconcile, to bring unity. And so a lot of the historic wounds that are not triggered today, I think it is very important for us to engage in a process where healing takes place for them. So we don't keep adding new wounds and new traumas into our collective body. Now, as I said, the wounds that are happening today, they need to stop so that a healing process can take place. So at that point, I agree with you fully. And to stop them, it means we need resistance and we need resiliency and we need international pressure to say, stop the genocide, stop the war, stop the occupation, stop land confiscation, stop destroying water resources for Palestinians, stop killing Palestinian livestock and sheep and goats. And that is what we need to stop the wound now. People out in the global community say no, and if Israel does not comply, then there is a price to pay through different tools that the international community can engage in. And I would say, for me, this is not just about Israel or Palestine. Any nation that is oppressing another nation needs to be told by the international community to stop. This is why we still want to believe that there is international law, that there is international precedent, that we learned the lessons of the Second World War, where all of these conventions took place to say that the global community will not remain silent when something in Rwanda is happening, when something in India is happening, when something in the US is happening, even when something in Germany is happening. We need to be able to say no, the international community itself.
How do you work with grief and rage, especially among young people?
Yeah. The way we do this is create space. Again, this is part of the healing. This is part of the healing work that we do. We create a space where people come together and grieve and share stories and cry together and mourn together, because grieving and mourning is part of the healing journey. And anger and rage, for me, are sacred. If we see injustice happening somewhere and we are not angry and enraged by it, then we have lost our humanity. It doesn't matter, again, who it is happening to. So for me, it is not the anger itself that is the issue. It is what we do with the anger. And the question we always ask is, do we take the sacred anger and transform it into sacred activism? Or we take this anger and transform it into hatred and resentment and demonizing the other. And so it's a very thin line, and it's a choice we can make every moment. I am angry at something that somebody did, and I could choose what I want to do with this anger. But the anger is real, and it is legitimate, and for me, it is sacred. And so we create space to allow for that anger to happen so that we could also maintain it and control it and ask how it's going to manifest itself into action in the future.
How can trauma healing be a foundation for a new political vision?
Well, in a sense, trauma healing liberates us from the past that limits the possibility of any future vision. If two sides come together and they are traumatized from other experiences, and you ask them to be in relationship with each other, they will never manifest a good relationship. And I say this in personal relationships or collective. A man who is traumatized and a woman who is traumatized, or two people who are traumatized, come together because they found attraction to each other. But then, as soon as they start meeting and connecting and going out together, their traumas come out. Their unhealed, unresolved issues come out. And that past will become the lens of how we engage with each other in the future. And so healing trauma does not negate the past, does not delete the past. It allows the past to belong where it belongs, which is in the past. And so when trauma is present in me in the present, that means the past is coming into the present to help me decide what are the future steps I want to take. And these steps are usually connected to mistrust, to doubt, to fear, to protective measures, to power over the other. When I put the past where it belongs, in that sense of healing, putting it where it belongs, then my decisions in the present can be motivated more by the future I want to create, not the past that I experienced. So if I'm in a relationship with somebody that I allow myself to put the trauma where it belongs and not be present in my present life, then I could look into that person and say, oh, what is the future I want to create? And that future becomes created from a place of trust and respect that is mutual, not fear and trauma that separates us from each other. So as Palestinians and Israelis, for sure, this is why I do this work. The moment we are able to put the traumas behind us and those stories behind us, honor them, learn from them so that we don't repeat the mistakes that happened then we could see a future where unity, trust, respect, justice for all, equality for all can manifest. This is definitely the hope that I have.
You've also spoken about the inner journey of peace building. What role does spirituality, especially your Christian faith, play in sustaining your work?
Yeah. So there are one of the terms that we engage in quite often and talk about a lot is the term called sacred activism. Because there are many people that are engaging in activism. But as we know very well, a lot of the people that are engaged in activism are motivated by hate, or motivated by a desire to demonize and dehumanize the other, even in nonviolence. So I could be physically nonviolent in my protest, but my heart can be filled with resentment and hate to a great level towards the other. So these are the activism component. There are many people in the world that are engaged in spirituality. Maybe you know many of them that are just about, I need to find my inner peace. I need to take care of myself. I need to have my chakras balanced. I cannot deal with the outside world because the outside world affects my inner journey and my inner peace work and so on. And so they do retreats, they do yoga, they do many things, but they are not engaged in what's happening in the world. They isolate themselves from the world. What we are inviting people to is to combine the two. And that's why we call it sacred activism. It's activism that is driven by a deep spiritual commitment to the healing that we need to do between us as humans and also between us and the planet that we are destroying every day of our life as well. And then the notion of the sacred activism comes from indigenous communities all around the world. This is how they engaged in resiliency and resistance. One great example is a few years ago, a movement in the United States in an area called Standing Rock, if you've heard of it, where indigenous communities came together to protest an oil pipeline that was going to go through their sacred land in a state called South Dakota. And they came in with this sacred activism and the call, water is life, because that pipeline would have destroyed their water resources. And they said, water is life for the earth, water is life for us as indigenous, and water is life even for those who are putting the pipeline in. And so they stood together in prayer and in protest. And this is something that, for me, I honor deeply. And so, yes, it could come from any spiritual experience. I would, like you asked me about my Christian background. My Christian background is more about Jesus than Christianity, because I actually think Christianity has done more violence and destruction in the world than all other religions combined. But when I look into the teachings of Jesus, yes, it was about loving the enemy. Yes, it was about forgiveness. Yes, it was, again, standing in the face of injustice. Yes, it was against the structures of power and hierarchy, turning the tables in the temple. And so for me, He was a model of bringing sacredness and activism together. And I say this exists in every religious tradition and spiritual tradition in the world.
Dr. Awad, thank you deeply for sharing your heart and wisdom with us today. This conversation felt like a gift. Next time, we'll continue the series with Alexandria Senft, author and granddaughter of a Nazi perpetrator who explores the trauma of silence and guilt in post-war Germany.
We're truly thankful for your time, Dr. Awad.
Thank you, Alexander and Yusuf. You are wonderful hosts.
Thank
Keep
you.
up the good job. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation was meaningful or unsettling, if it left you with answers or more questions, feel free to like, share and subscribe. See you next time on our Israel-Palestine podcast.